Preparing the stream. Wonderful, and we are live. Okay, preparing the stream and some feedback there. Wonderful, and we are live. Hey, Professor Brown, I'm going to send you the link to the YouTube.
Okay, perfect.
If you could just let me know if you can see that.
All right, I got it, and I will post it to the Facebook.
Wonderful. Okay, I have one issue, which is that I don't know how to mute the YouTube, so I don't hear it.
You can just, I think if you can close the window. Like
I can close the window and you'll still see it.
You don't need to leave it open.
Okay, great.
Okay.
All right, I did that. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for bearing with me. Welcome, everyone. My name is Simona Supekar. I'm a professor in the English department at PCC. I am so excited to close out our Visiting Writers program with our final writer for the semester, writer, activist, and organizer, Anjali Enjeti. I am just thrilled and honored to be here with her today. And again, just a reminder for those of you who are joining that this is being broadcast to YouTube and also recorded on Zoom. So before we begin, I'd like to start with some thank yous because there are a lot of people who helped with this event. Our Visiting Writer program would not be possible without the generous support of the Pasadena Festival of Women Authors. Their amazing festival returns in person on March 19th, 2022, and will feature award-winning author Dana Spiotta. Find out more about the event on their website at the PasadenaLiteraryAlliance.org. Also, special thanks to our liaison with the PFWA, Amy Ulmer. I would also like to thank Dean Tuktuk Tongtaraj, Anna Davis, and Lucky Springfield in the English division for their continuous support and their behind-the-scenes support of all of our programs. And of course, I'd like to thank my fellow colleagues on the Visiting Writers Committee, Professor Akila Brown and Dr. Kirsten Ogden, for all of their hard work on these fabulous programs that we've been putting on. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all of our wonderful writing students who attend these programs and continue to inspire us with their beautiful words. Before we begin our event today, I'd also just like to acknowledge that the sites that make up Pasadena City College exist on the indigenous homelands of the Tongva people. Student equity at PCC and the various faculty, staff, and students who partner with us to support student success recognize that we are all teachers, learners, and guests on these lands. This land is an acknowledgement of a small acknowledgement of the ongoing process of working to be in a good relationship with the land and the people of the land, and embodying equity in practice as well as theory. Okay, I'd like to just give a little bit of background about our writer today. Anjali Enjeti is a former attorney and journalist based in Atlanta, Georgia. She is the author of the essay collection Southbound, Essays on Identity, Inheritance, and Social Change, and the novel The Parted Earth. Her writing about politics, social justice, and books has appeared in the Oxford American, USA Today, Harper's Bazaar, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, The Nation, and elsewhere. A former board member of the National Book Critics Circle, she is the recipient of awards from the South Asian Journalists Association and the American Society of Journalists and Authors, as well as residencies from the Hambidge Center, Sundress Academy of the Arts, and Wild Acres. She teaches in the MFA program at Reinhardt University. So before we begin chatting, I just want to let you know that you can certainly add questions and comments into the chat. And we're going to start with a short reading, and the remainder of the program will just be talking. So feel free to, again, drop in questions and comments into the chat. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Anjali.
Thank you so much, Professor Supekar and Professor Brown. It is such an incredible honor to be here with you both and with all of you writing students. This is one of my favorite things to do, is to talk to other writers. And I know that in the time we have together this afternoon, I am likely going to learn just as much, if not more, from you all than what you all will learn from me. I'm going to start by reading a short excerpt from Southbound. This is in the chapter entitled Southbound, and it's kind of in the middle part of the essay here. The fall of my freshman year in college, I learned that I was the only one of my close girlfriends, all of whom were white, who did not receive one of the beautifully embossed invitation to the city's debutante ball, the Cotton Ball. Like other debutante balls, the Cotton Ball is a coming out party for young women of marriageable age, an elaborate celebration of the upper financial crust, of spheres of influence whose members could trace their family trees back several generations to the South's storied antebellum legacy, white people's glory days before the Civil War. Debutante balls were not born of the South. Queen Elizabeth I began the tradition in England during her reign in the latter half of the 1500s. Lucky debutantes in their late teens to early 20s curtsied before the Queen with the hope of a prompt engagement. 400 years later, in 1958, Queen Elizabeth II banned the tradition, owing to corruption. Today, debutante balls are still held all over the United States, though their popularity has waxed and waned over time. This formerly Eurocentric rite of passage, though, has evolved into something distinctly Southern. Chattanooga's Cotton Ball, one of the oldest debutante balls in the Southern United States, was started in 1933 by a woman named Zella Armstrong. Ironically, Armstrong never married, and according to her gravestone, had a career as an author, editor, and publisher. Her father, Captain John McMillan Armstrong, served in the Confederate Army. Slavery was barely in the rearview mirror in the South, and Jim Crow and the separate but equal doctrine ensured the continued subjugation of Black people. Though over the years, a handful of Black women and other women of color have been presented, Chattanooga's ball remains largely a celebration of whiteness, of aristocracy and old money, of men's ownership of women, and an ode to the selective memory of a region's cruel and traumatic history. The mere idea of the Cotton Ball seemed so absurdly racist, sexist, and classist, I could hardly believe it still existed in the early 1990s. Belles, a year out of high school with hair swept into elaborate updos, wore satin or silk gowns that swished as they waltzed and curtsied. The Queen, a recent former belle, was paired with the King, an older adult male at least twice her age. The fact that few people seem bothered by the optics of this is still mind-blowing to me. But when all of my white friends received invitations to the Cotton Ball and I didn't, it hurt like hell. Despite years of existing in an environment that glorified whiteness, of attempting to be seen in a landscape of whiteness, of incessant othering, I still longed to be included. After learning from my former high school classmates that the invitations had been mailed out, I remember calling my mother and tearfully asking if she could please double check the mailbox and make sure my invitation wasn't hiding somewhere amid the junk mail. I had no intention of actually attending the Cotton Ball. In fact, I had already composed a letter in my mind to accompany my RSVP declining the invitation, expressing my disappointment that the institution continued to serve almost exclusively white women. But these conflicting emotions of disappointment and revenge barely scratched the surface of the forces at play. At age 19, I still wholly bought into white supremacy. I hated that I wasn't invited to the Cotton Ball. I also loathed myself for wanting to be invited. Around and around I went, disparaging the Cotton Ball while envying those lucky enough to be able to choose not to attend. The Cotton Ball confirmed every suspicion I'd ever had. White people would never see me as worthy, and it was my own damn fault for trying to prove them wrong. In my teens and early 20s, I still lacked the clarity or the consciousness to reckon with the ways I was directly perpetuating harm against other brown and Black people. Vijay Prashad writes about this in his book, The Karma of Brown Folk, utilizing the framework in W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. He asks, how can we live with ourselves as we are pledged and sometimes, in an act of bad faith, pledge ourselves as a weapon against Black folk? What does it mean for us to mollify the wrath of white supremacy by making a claim to a great destiny? Longing for a white supremacist goal while complaining about racism is about much more than hypocrisy. The centering of my own individual injustice actively marginalized other brown and Black people. It also fed right into the model minority myth. I deserved a Cotton Ball invitation because other brown and Black women weren't as deserving. Though I did not possess the lens to understand it, my hurt and humiliation were rooted in a racism and the deep-seated belief that after white women, I was the next best thing. The brown desire for white benefits has historical roots in the US. In 1927, in Gang Lum v. Rice, the Supreme Court upheld the decision of the Mississippi School Board to exclude 9-year-old Chinese American Martha Lum from a white public school because she was colored. Certainly, Chinese Americans faced and have always faced racial discrimination. But the Lum family believed that their Asian American identity made them superior to Black families and entitled them to white rights. My desire for a Cotton Ball invitation was a desire born of a social contract that I, and I imagine Martha Lum, had subconsciously signed at birth. In exchange for years of conformity, silence, humiliation, abuse, and erasure, white people and white institutions would reward us with eventual acceptance and inclusion. Or so we thought. But that's not how whiteness works. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reading that incredibly powerful section. There's so much in what you just read, Anjali, that I want to talk about, really. And I think it's a great jumping off point for questions that attendees might have and some questions I have. So I guess one of the first things that came up for me was, as a Californian now, hearing about a debutante ball, right? I think some of my students didn't know about this sort of event. And I grew up in Virginia and Maryland, so I knew a little bit about it, but I've been gone for a while. So it's really interesting kind of to see the ways in which white supremacy manifests itself in different ways regionally. And so, reading about this ball and the nuanced feelings you have about it really added a level of depth and richness to it that I enjoyed personally. And then the interjection of the history on top of that is another layer. And then the interjection of Vijay Prashad and his, sort of cultural framework is another layer. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is just, how did you approach writing a text so deeply layered and nuanced like this? And I guess that's a kind of a big question. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about the process of research. You have 25 pages of footnotes. So how were you able to kind of take these really interesting events and concepts and layer them so in such a nuanced way?
Yes, well, that is a great question. And I will assure you that yes, the footnotes might have aggravated some of the folks at my press when they were double checking them and formatting them. So that is a really good question. And I will start by saying that I started writing personal essays. It's my favorite subgenre, by the way, of anything. I love reading personal essays and memoir. I love writing them. And I started writing them about 20 years ago. I wrote them through, of course, school and college, but I started writing them professionally about 20 years ago. And, initially when I was writing to understand myself and writing very personal experiences. And many of my essays were very much rooted in identity. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until I started doing freelance journalism, becoming a reporter, becoming an organizer in the Asian American space and in other spaces before that, that I began realizing how much my identity was contextual, how much my identity was very much shaped by socio-cultural and political forces. And that actually, as a personal essayist, I was not really doing a whole lot of deep thinking in my personal essays. I was really sort of going into myself emotionally, right? I was turning over experiences. I was looking at them in the context of my family history, of my personal history. But I really wasn't doing the very deep-seated work that needed to be done, which was to look at my personal experiences in a historical context, in a socio-geopolitical context. And because I wasn't doing that work, what I was providing as a service to readers was sort of an ability for them to be able to say, oh, I get that, I feel that way, or I don't understand what she's talking about. Now, certainly, personal essays have immense value in the way that they connect us to one another and the way that they build community. But when I thought about my personal essays from the perspective of the organizing work I do, which isn't just about connecting people to one another, but is about making systemic change a real possibility. It's really about pushing against oppression. I realized that my essays needed to have a bigger function than what they currently had. I realized that my essays were something that felt good to me. They felt a way to vent, to work through trauma, to process my experiences, but then their value really ended there. And in fact, they did not go that further step, which was to challenge systems of power that hold so many people back, that cause so much violence and abuse. And so I had to really then start doing the research and really start taking a look at the amazing scholars out there and writers, but also the activists out there who I'd studied incidentally back in college, but had sort of moved away from in my work, first as an attorney and then as a writer. So then I started going back to the basics. I started going back to text. I started rereading my Audre Lorde and my Zora Neale Hurston and my Vandana Shiva. And I started taking a look at the thinkers and the scholars and the activists, the people who actually used their writing as a tool, as a mechanism for social change. And I realized, okay, I may not be able to have that kind of incredible scholarship and thinking that these folks that I've always admired have, but I could push myself to do more in the essay form. And my journalism background made that probably a little bit of an easier transition when I started writing this book, because I did a lot of reporting in the past several years about politics, specifically Georgia politics, about voter suppression. I did some work on immigration. So I sort of had that background. So I thought, okay, I think I can do this. It's really a matter of sort of combining the journalism, but using a personal lens to sort of get to that journalism. And, let's be real, a lot of the folks did this thinking before me, right? There's not anything incredibly original to my book, it's just filtered through my own personal experiences. And I think that ended up making, for me, not only my personal experiences and my personal concept of identity make more sense, but it made me realize how powerful identity as a concept is and what it can do for all of us when we really look deeply, reckon with identity, and think about how our identity upholds a lot of these harmful systems of power that many of us have been complicit in, myself included.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much. A lot of what you're saying really resonates, with me as a writer, and I think also with, we have a lot of student writers here who are writing researched essays. I know my students have just completed one. And the idea of writing about things that other people have written is challenging, right? Because you want to be able to say something new or different. And it really was obvious to me that lens is really important here. I could even, I could see your legal background in the, in the discussion around legal cases. Your identity as a mixed race person, your identity as a child who has all these other cultures in your background too, really informs the narrative and does transform it into something, new and different. So I guess one question I might have is, how can a student writer or a writer trying to accomplish, what you're doing, which is writing about something that they're passionate about, but that other people have written about, how can they write about it in this nuanced way, and really have their clear lens on it? Do you have any kind of techniques or writing exercises or anything you've done to kind of help hone that skill?
Wow, that's a great but very tough question. So let me say at the outset, a lot of people who write essays feel that their perspective does not bring value to a conversation. And I first want to say that every single writer has something valuable and important to say. And the first step would be is to not dismiss yourself, to not start out being your own worst enemy and think, well, what am I going to say about X issue that, no one else, anyone else has ever said in the history of writing, right? I think it's very easy for us to do that as writers. If you are passionate about something, whether it's a political issue, a social issue, a cultural issue, you are the person to write it. The challenge will come from what perspective you are going to write it from. And this is where you might need to seek out the advice of other writers. For one, you don't want to write from a perspective that could end up doing harm to a community, right? To a community that is most impacted about whatever issue that you're trying to write about. So one would be to gather your fellow writers and to really hash out what issues you're interested in, how you want to approach it, and what would be some of the risks in writing what you want to write about, right? I'll give you an example. One of the essay that was by far the hardest for me to write in Southbound was the Vincent Chin essay, right? There were a lot of risks in me choosing to write about his life and his death. First of all, when you write about a person who has endured violence, you are always risking making it trauma porn, right? Or tragedy porn. Second of all, I'm not Chinese American, and there was a risk in me writing about the discrimination that East Asians in particular were dealing with at that time. Now, certainly South Asians have had their share of discrimination, but I was writing about anti-Japanese sentiment that was felt through East and Southeast Asians predominantly during this time. So there was that danger, right? And so in order to write, I had to not only do significant amounts of research on Vincent Chin, on this really unique era in US history when the Japanese automobile industry was on the verge of building plants on US soil. And we're in fact, going to be buying US plants and then pushing out the US automobile industry. So I had to figure out, where am I in this story? And so because I had the experience of living 15 minutes from Vincent Chin when he was murdered, of witnessing as an 8-year-old, watching the local news every single night that covered the multiple legal cases that went through the system, none of which of course resulted in any relief for Vincent's family. I knew that that was a way that I could approach writing about his life in a way that was in deference to his family's suffering, in a way that was respectful, in a way that showed how my Asian American identities sort of started forming in my mind. Before then, before the age of 8, before he was killed, I was not even really thinking that much about race. I went to school with kids from many different backgrounds. I lived in a neighborhood that was full of automobile families where the father worked at one of the companies. And so I had both of these cultures that I was sort of immersed in, but I had not really understood the concept of race at that time, or racism. I think I'd heard some racist comments as a child, but I didn't really understand them as anything more than just normal sort of teasing that kids do. And so the death of Vincent Chin really helped me go there. So research, collaborating with other writers that are doing the same kind of writing, the mixing of the sort of personal story with reported pieces. I hired an authenticity reader for this book, or editor. Some people call them sensitivity editors, because at the end of the day, I am still a writer saturated in white supremacy, and I have been since I was born 48 years ago. And I couldn't really trust myself to write the essays in this book without an outside expert. Now, I have writer friends who read my work and who give me feedback, and almost all of them are brown and Black women. So it's not as if I didn't have other folks reading it. But I found, and I have found over the years, that authenticity editors really have a skill set, right? It's a profession, and they will really deconstruct for you what's going on, what passage I've phrased in a way that could be harmful, right? What language I might be using that is language of the colonizer, right? So, and is it appropriate in some instances? Yes, but not in others. So I had professionals help me with this. Well, I had mainly one, but a woman who runs a business, who is an editor, and she does authenticity editing. And so I find that approaching these kinds of really tough topics, it really is imperative to approach them humbly, to approach them realizing that even if you do all the research in the world, you're still not going to have all the answers. And while that's okay, you still want to make sure that you do everything in your power to not do harm with your writing, right? To be thorough, to acknowledge the ways that you fall short, even as a writer, which I did throughout the book, right? I mean, I freely admitted ways that I might have contributed to harmful thinking. And I'll tell you what, I really think readers appreciate that. I really don't think a reader expects a writer to know everything and to know the best way to think about really tough issues. So I think approaching it very humbly and really interrogating everything that you bring to the table, the good and the bad, is essential to doing this sort of personal reporting hybrid sort of essay.
Thank you so much. That's really, really helpful. I think Professor Brown has a question, and then we'll go to some of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, I have a really, I hope, quick question. So, you know, we have a lot of beginning writers here. So I just want to say, you mentioned that you decided that you wanted to have more impact with your writing and things like that. How long were you writing before you decided to switch gears to say, I'm going to move from the personal essay to doing a personal essay, but now have that more external focus with it?
So that's a great question, Professor Brown. Thank you for asking me. So I started about 13 years ago, trying to think, because my youngest kid is 13, and maybe she was 1 or 2. So I started probably 11 or 12 years ago, trying to break into other forms of writing. I was also just tired of writing personal essays because it's exhausting. It's very mentally taxing work. So I started where I started after I had done personal essays almost exclusively for 6 or 7 years, was in book criticism. I started writing book reviews on a blog because I didn't really even know how to pitch book reviews at the time. And then I started writing for a local online publication. It's wonderful. It's still around. It's called Arts ATL. And it's they feature, they write criticism and interviews with all kinds of artists, visual artists and performers and authors. And I started doing author interviews and book criticism. And I started really sort of enjoying doing that kind of deep analysis and not writing necessarily about myself at all, and really sort of then understanding how to talk about the cultural issues that books introduce. So then once I had done a lot of sort of profiles and interviews, then I started pitching articles. And in fact, it's weird because I believe my earliest sort of political articles came to me first. I was just really active on Twitter, and I was talking about politics, and I keep up with politics, especially local politics. And so I was just tweeting and tweeting and tweeting about that. And finally, people just started approaching me like, oh, well, you want to write about that abortion ban that everyone's, that's been passed in Georgia, or you want to write about this? And I started writing about it. And I thought, well, gosh, this is definitely something that I really enjoy. So I think the lesson there is, Professor Brown, get on Twitter. If you're not already there, get there.
I don't know if that's what I would say the lessons. So I just want to reiterate for our writers who are watching that Anjali says she started first doing personal essays. She wrote those for years, became interested in doing book criticism. So she went where her interests were and was writing about those, and that developed it. So, I mean, I just wanted, because along with the statement you made about, don't psych yourself out. I just wanted to make sure that they understood that this was a years-long process before you got to that point. And so, yeah, I think, Simona, I'll hand it back to you so we can get to the student questions.
Awesome. Great question, Professor Brown. Okay, so we have some comments and questions here from Erica. She wrote, doing the deep and emotional historical work is hard, and even harder when done alone. Anjali, you just mentioned Vandana Shiva. In part 2, under inheritance, you quote Shiva, "You are not Atlas carrying the world on your shoulder. It is good to remember that the planet is carrying you." I wonder if you're hinting there at your realization that you need to take new approaches to doing the deep work, but from a lens that is not all on you, but also on the world to meet you halfway.
Yeah, wow. Well, Erica, that is like the perfect analysis for why I used that quote. I don't have a whole lot more to add. It's interesting, Professor Shiva said that quote in an interview somewhere, and I'd known about it for like 25 years. I love that quote. And then it took me a while to actually track down where it was originally. And, you know, she is an environmental activist, right? She's an ecological feminist, I think was the term when she was much younger, doing this very, very important work, way, way ahead of her time. You know, it made me think about how much writing is like activism. It really is best done in a coalition. It's best done in a community where you can brainstorm, where you can get feedback from one another, where you can find somebody who reads your drafts, where you could even just sort of talk out issues that you're dealing with, that you see happening in the world. Because it's these sort of conversations, it's this dialogue that really helps us process what all we're holding in our head, right? Especially right now during this pandemic. So I just felt like that was a really great quote to sort of marry one of the themes of the book, which is that we are ultimately all part of a community, all needing to sort of uplift together and carry the burdens together. So great question though, Erica.
Our next question is from Albert, who asks, did you have favorite creative nonfiction authors growing up? And have these favorites changed over the years?
Wow, that's a great question. So growing up, I read almost only fiction. I read novel after novel after novel. But probably in my 20s, I started delving in more nonfiction. I started reading essays and speeches. I mean, Audre Lorde, who I also quote in the book, she's one of my all-time favorite nonfiction writers. I read several books of Vandana Shiva's, who I also quote. As I mentioned, you know, Zora Neale Hurston has wonderful essays. I think she's so well known for her fiction, but actually, I think her essays are a mix of like memoir, reporting, biography, and ethnography. Like, I don't think I know of any writer anywhere who can quite write like she writes. And so yeah, so it was more in my 20s that I really started delving into nonfiction. When I was younger than that, I really just wanted to read fiction. Joan Didion was another writer that I gravitated to when I first nonfiction writers that I gravitated to when I started reading nonfiction. But I also just read a lot of personal essays in magazines, in newspapers. And it was before the time when sort of the personal essay genre exploded, right? There were only so many magazines in my library that had personal essays. There were Harper's, there was the New Yorker, right? Occasionally, you know, Harper's Bazaar, Newsweek, Cosmopolitan, right? But what's happened is that there are just so many more options and so many more platforms, and essays are so much more accessible now. So I have to wonder if maybe I would have gotten more interested in nonfiction when I was much younger, if personal essays and shorter pieces of nonfiction were something that I encountered more than I ended up doing.
And all of that fiction is also really good training for creative nonfiction, right? Because we're using all of those same elements, which
Absolutely.
is
yes, creative nonfiction at the end of the day is storytelling. It's narrative, and all of the skills and all of everything you bring from fiction, it still ends up and as right, you know, if you write it truthfully, it's riveting nonfiction.
Exactly. So our next question is from Clay, who asks, how would you describe postcolonial writing and its purpose in our current climate?
You know, Clay, this is such a difficult and often.
I think you might have frozen. unless it's just my computer.
No, she froze for me too.
Okay.
Live.
All right, give it just.
Okay. Do you want to maybe text her, Simona, and let her know?
Yeah,
Sorry, excuse me.
it's okay. You can call me.
But whatever she was saying, it was riveting, as we know.
I know. On the edge of my seat.
Okay, it looks like her video dropped out, so she should know that she.
Yeah, I'm hoping she'll be joining us.
Okay. There you are. Hi. You're muted.
Right.
So we lost you right as you said, this is an excellent and difficult question.
I'm so sorry, y'all.
It's
I
okay.
usually don't get kicked out of Zoom rooms in this space in my house, but oh well. So yes, so I think it's really difficult. I think it's a really difficult term, and I feel at times very uncomfortable using the term post-colonial because I still feel like we are very much in an age of colonization, right? We are still on unceded territory. We still have the effects of the United States withdrawal on other countries. I mean, it lasts generations, right? It lasts hundreds and hundreds of years. Technically, when people say post-colonial, right, they mean the year that colonization officially, right, on paper ended. But I don't find the term particularly useful because we see the effects everywhere, day to day, of colonization. We have not even fixed the problems. We've not even really touched the problems that colonization has caused. And, if we're talking about nation states, I mean, we are still a colonizing nation state. I mean, we are still everywhere on other people's lands, depriving those folks of their resources, of their political power. We're still asserting ourselves in other governments, which continue to lead to genocide, suffering, civil wars. So yeah, it's a really complicated word, and it's a word that I'm still really trying to figure out how to use in my own writing. And I'm still kind of turning it around in my head and trying to interrogate it and trying to understand how to use it in a way so that it's functional, but without sort of erasing the very contemporary problems that we still have and we still engage in as a colonizing nation.
Thank you. Our next question is from Michaela, who asks, as a mom, I have to wonder, have your kids followed in your footsteps and become activists themselves? And has it changed how you parented?
So, that is a great question, Michaela. Thank you for asking it. So my oldest daughter she's going to be 20 actually at the end of this month. And then I have a senior in high school and then an 8th grader. So it's so funny because when they were all I've been so politically active for many years that's kind of all they know. But I think until they enter high school, they kind of just resent it about me, right? Because my activism means that dinner is not on the table, that I'm constantly in a meeting, that I forget to get birthday gifts for their friends' birthday parties, right? It's very much a function of me not being present in a lot of ways. I mean, this is just me being very honest. It's very hard to work full-time and then to also basically be a full-time activist, right? People, you have to make sacrifices. There's no other way to do it. But my older 2 kids, my 13-year-old is still trying to sort of tune out everything I do. She's like, I don't want to talk about politics. But my almost 20-year-old has worked on multiple political campaigns. She heads up activist organizations. My 17-year-old has been to just about every protest, march. She's attended school board meetings. She heads a activist organization at school, which she helped to found. I mean, they eventually, my brainwashing eventually finds its way in, I think. At this point, probably my dog is an activist, but I hope what they are absorbing from me is the importance of taking a break from it, and the importance of kind of making sure that your own needs are met while you're doing this work. I still have to remind them, you know, you're no good to anybody and you're no good to the cause if you are constantly exhausted, stressed out. You need to take a break. You need to eat. You need to sleep. You need to focus on things that bring you joy, because it's a very tough space to be in. It's very exhausting. But we don't do any good if we are empty, right? We have to have some kind of, we have to fill ourselves up in some way in order to do it well. So I'm trying to sort of to teach and reteach that lesson to my own children, and fingers crossed some of that is getting through.
Thank you. Yeah, self-care is very important in this kind of work. Our next question is from Juliet, who asks, how did your sense of self change while writing Southbound? And did any self-reflection in the writing process change the direction of your writing?
Juliet, I'm so glad you asked this question. So between the book proposal for Southbound and the actual book coming out was almost 3 years. It was like 2 years and 8 months, something like that. And when I submitted the proposal for Southbound, I had proposed that 50% of the essays would already be published, and then 50% of the essays would be new. I think there's 20 essays in the collection. So 10 were going to be previously published and 10 would be new. But when I actually started working on the collection and writing the new essays and rereading my old essays, I realized that I had changed so much as a person that I could not use most of these old essays. Now, of course, when you publish an essay collection, your press will give you the opportunity to revise and update your essays, right? Because everybody's perspective changes, right, over time. So something you wrote 10 years ago is you're not gonna be the same person. And a lot of people do update these essays. But what I realized was that I had changed so fundamentally that I would never have written some of the essays that I wrote. I just wouldn't have written them at all. And so I found myself thinking that I was only going to be writing 10-ish essays and realizing that, oh, crap, I am going to have to write a lot more than this because I cannot use that garbage anymore. So I had to really start from scratch in a lot of ways. And I think the essay collection now is like 20% older essays and 80% new essays. So yes, so I changed as a person from originally publishing a lot of these essays. And then I changed while writing it. I had touched on complicity in my book proposal, but I was still looking for ways to make myself look good. Still looking for ways to make myself look more anti-racist than what I was. And then when I was writing draft after draft after draft over a couple of years, I was finally getting to the point where I could really be honest about my complicity in a way that I couldn't be when I first proposed the essay collection. And that was just me growing as a person, right? That was me finally sort of confronting things that felt too scary, right? Nobody wants to look bad in their own essay collection, right? Nobody wants to look like someone who's like the oppressor. But I was. And so I had to reckon with that. And it was really hard to do so. But that was the one wonderful thing about having so much time and working with the university press is one, they tend to be very slow. And so, but their very slow publishing process was a benefit to me because I was changing so much as I was writing it that I was able to come up with a collection that was much more honest than the one that I started with.
I have a question kind of connected to that. And I know it came up in my classes, and I think Professor Brown raised this question about genre. You mentioned the Vincent Chin chapter, and that chapter, after I read that, I had to take some time away from the book and kind of let it really absorb. It really, really hit me. I think, for all the reasons you described, the subject matter, but also just the empathy that you had in that essay. And then the format of it, right? It's different. You wrote it as an elegy. And then you have another chapter that's written as a poem.
Mhm.
So you have these other kind of genres that defy their traditional personal essay linear narrative. And I wanted to know how you, and Professor Brown is asking this as well, how did you know that this was going to take this form for this particular essay? And how did you make those decisions to include those different genres in your book?
So I will tell you a very funny story about how I came to the form of the Vincent Chin essay. I had been thinking of writing about an essay about Vincent Chin for at least 10 years before I wrote a single word of this essay. I couldn't do it. I couldn't figure out how to do it. I didn't know how to approach it. I didn't know what angle I was going to take. I had no idea. So I did something that I never do when I am writing. I wrote an outline. I've just never written in an outline form, whether I'm doing a really heavily reported piece. I didn't use an outline for my novel, had never used an outline for any book I've ever attempted to finish. So I decided to write an outline. A friend of mine, author Piali Bhattacharya, I don't know, do you know her? Do you all know? I think
I do.
Okay. She was living in Nashville and teaching at Vanderbilt at the time. And she and her husband were both professors there. They're now in Philadelphia. They invited me up to like a reading with a bunch of folks in their house. Super informal thing. One of the writers was Naomi Munawira, who is a novelist. And there was a couple of other writer folks that I either knew of but anyway, I felt comfortable among all of them, right? It wasn't a formal reading. And they said, just read whatever you want. And I said, I don't want to read any of my old work, but since I'm going to be in a living room with really smart writers who I admire, I'm going to read my outline. I'm going to read part of my outline and ask people to help me figure out how to tell this story, because I've been struggling with so long with how to write it. So I read an outline which actually looks like the essay. I wrote a list of non-chronological events in Asian American history, and then I wrote sections. I wrote it just like this. I mean, I wrote, parts that were just short paragraphs, none of them in much of an order. And I said, I'm going to read you all this outline, and then I want you to help me figure out how to structure this piece. And Naomi at the end raised her hand and was like, that's how you write the essay. Just like how you read it. It's an outline. That's what you need to do. And I just thought, what? Like, I'm not like an experimental writer. I don't take a whole lot of risks in my writing. And I drove back home to Atlanta, and I looked at my outline and I was like, my goodness, they are right. The reason I had such a terrible time writing this essay was because I was trying to fit it into a traditional form. And this topic was never going to be able to be a traditional form. It was never just going to be straight prose. It wasn't going to be just a completely chronological telling of this killing. And so I think sometimes we as writers need to just really read and understand other forms of nonfiction writing, because sometimes what's holding us back from telling the stories we want to tell is the structure that we think it should be, when really the structure should maybe be something we've never tried before. And that's what I did for the Vincent Chin essay. And if I had not attended that reading in Nashville and gotten feedback, I probably never would have written this essay. It never would have made it in the book, because I was trying to force a traditional style of narrative onto something that just could not have ever been told that way.
And that also reinforces the importance of community, right? Community feedback and having a place where you trust other people to read your work. And I think that's probably a good segue into this next question from Maria, who asks, what are you currently reading? Is there a book you would recommend for training and writing similar to Edwidge Danticat's Create Dangerously, a book I love too?
Oh gosh, yes, what a fantastic book. So I've actually read, it's interesting. I've actually read a lot of nonfiction this year. Well, first of all, my caveat is that since the pandemic started, I actually had a really hard time reading anything, especially last year. I had so much difficulty concentrating on reading. But the last few months, it's let up a little bit. So I have read some really interesting nonfiction work. So most recently, what I read was Victoria Chang's Dear Memory, which is non-traditional nonfiction. Highly recommend it. It just came out. Victoria Chang is a poet, but this book is actually told, it's an epistolary book. It's told in letters. So she writes letters to her grandmother. She writes letters to teachers, her friends, her parents, and it's told in family archives. So she has documents in the book where it's like, I think she's got like her parents' marriage certificate and other sorts of travel documents and family photographs. And she manipulates those documents to tell her story. So that's another book that just really, really sort of broke open and breaks open forms of storytelling, right? I don't really consider myself much of a poet, but when I see the way that poets like Victoria Chang approach other kinds of prose, I find it really inspiring to think about that structure, to really understand how we can tell our personal stories, and all the ways that we can approach it. I also just finished reading Hasi Sirisena's Dark Tourist, which is a collection of essays. It's not coming out until next month, but I had an advanced reader copy. So Hasanthika writes a blend of personal essay and cultural criticism. So there's definitely some research and probably some reporting in it, but she kind of moves in and out of personal story and a cultural critique of socio-cultural political forces around her. And she's a South Asian writer. She's specifically a Sri Lankan writer. She's Sinhalese. She's a queer writer. And so she's really sort of exploring the context of her identity in a sort of larger cultural picture. So that was another wonderful book. I also read recently Hama Abedin's 500-page memoir, which I could not put down. So if you're interested in personal storytelling in a political context, highly recommend the book. I am usually not a fan of large books, but again, could not put this book down. It was so, so good. What's another book? Hi Yella is a memoir that also came out from University of Georgia Press. It is a memoir of a man who is a very, very light-skinned Black man growing up in a very rural part of New York and trying to understand race in the context of his Black family. And he ends up adopting 2 Black girls and marrying a white Jewish man. So there's a whole lot of going on there as far as mixed race families, mixed faith families, mixed gendered, mixed sexual identity families. Excellent, excellent book. So anyway, those are 4 of the most recent books that I've read this year. All of them happen to be nonfiction.
Sorry, what was the title of that last book or the author?
Oh, sorry. Hi Yella is Steve. I am forgetting his last name. Steve Majors. Steve Majors.
Okay.
Excellent book. It just came out from UGA Press, and he's a veteran broadcast journalist. So I suppose that's where some of his storytelling came from, but it is a knockout memoir. And I just love, it's not chronological at all. So if you're working on a memoir, but you don't want to do something chronological, the way Steve Majors ties his childhood memories with his adult memories that happen later on, like there's this juxtaposition of them. So thematically, a lot of these scenes that were in the past and then followed by a present day scene are tied together in these really clever ways. So highly, highly recommend it.
Thank you so much for these great recommendations. So we're at 3:02 now, and I think it's about time to wrap up. Like I said, the hour really goes very quickly. Just want to see if I got everyone's questions. Professor Brown mentioned that Zora Neale Hurston was an anthropologist. Very good fact. Tolu mentioned that an outline can be really helpful. And yes, I used to have my students do those, and then I kind of dropped them, but I think it could be really helpful, especially for experimenting with form, like you mentioned.
Yes.
And I think that's it. All right. Well, usually we end with a question. Professor Brown has a great question about what you're watching or reading right now. And I think you covered the reading. So I think I'm going to just ask, what are you doing right now for self-care? Because you mentioned it earlier on, and the work that you're doing is really intense and important. And so I kind of just want to know, what are you doing, to survive and to take care of yourself? What is your joy, your delight, as Roske would say?
What a great question. So it's interesting what this pandemic has made me think more about. I have started, I'm a Gen Xer. I fall like right in the middle of the Gen X generation. And so I grew up only like the way to communicate with people was talking on the phone, right? Not Zoom talking on the phone, not texting, not DMing on social media. So I have made a significant effort in connecting with other people's voices. I've been calling people. They've been calling me. We've been doing things where we don't text each other first to ask permission if they're free to talk on the phone. We just call, and then if they're not, they don't answer. We just hang up and assume they'll call back. Connecting with people over the phone, especially in this time of so much social isolation, and then so much screen time, right? So much sitting in front of a screen and looking at people has really become an important kind of self-care for me. It's like I've rediscovered an art that I kind of lost somewhere in my 30s, I think. I was very late to sort of adopt cell phones, and then I was even later to adopt an iPhone and a smartphone. So I held on to the practice of speaking on the phone with people for a while, and then I just sort of dropped it. And I spending all my time texting and sending gifts and DMing and emailing. And then I just started calling people, and they started calling me. And it's just been a really great way to connect with voices. And you can really hear people, I think, on the phone in a way that you can't hear them when you're communicating online in some way. So that has been an important coping mechanism for me.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's really good advice. All right, everyone. I want to thank everyone for attending. Anjali, thank you so much. You have really given us so much to think about. I had a whole list of questions, and I think I only got to one or two. But I'm just so thrilled that we were able to sit and have such a great conversation together. And I hope everyone who attended also enjoyed. I want to thank you all again for coming. For more information about Anjali and her work, please visit her website at anjalienjeti.com. Also, please return back in January for our next semester of Visiting Writer events. We will return on January 25th with picture book artist Karen Yin, and we have a whole great slate of writers coming again next semester. So please do connect with us on Facebook, drop us a line, drop us a comment, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your semester and holiday season. And again, thank you, Anjali, so much for coming.
Thank you so
today.
much for having me. It was such an honor. Thanks so much, and good luck to y'all with your writing.
Thank you. All right, I will stop recording now.